Premier class? Priest up first.
A minute to settle down here. It's nice to see the sisters here.
Yeah.
And you're from Alvare, Mothers Group, House Chance from extremely long title community, Mothers of America, Naturalists, someplace.
Okay.
That's a good group. It's nothing behind there is in this group. It's really depressing. Buy your own order of nuns.
Well, good morning and welcome. The topic for this session, a concurrent session of the conference, is legislative and judicial issues at the beginning of life. And to help us explore those issues, we have two speakers. They will speak successively, one after the other, and after they've both spoken, we'll then have time for questions. And I think we should have 30 minutes or so for questions at the end. So I'll introduce our first speaker first. That makes rational sense, yes? And then, after she's spoken, I'll introduce our second speaker. Our first speaker, then, is Helen Alvare, who teaches property and family law at the Columbus School of Law at Catholic University of America, a position which she just began this fall. Before that, she has been a spokesperson for the U.S. Catholic bishops on matters to do with abortion, contraception, feminism, family life, and so forth. And she has also done work for the Vatican on those topics as well. She is a member, for example, of the Pontifical Council on Human Life, one of those complexly named Vatican entities. So that's an interesting career transition from the bureaucracy of the Church to the bureaucracy of the academy, and I imagine she's trying to decide at the moment which is preferable. Her interests have been for a long time in the complex of issues that surrounds procreation, marriage, family, and the position of women with respect to all those matters. And she will help us to understand today some of the currently pressing legislative and judicial issues surrounding the beginning of life. Helen.
Thank you. Morning. This is my first foray into the public after having taught exactly 12 classes in my new career. No one will be able to say of me here, I heard you speak 30 years ago at Princeton, because 30 years ago I was jumping rope in Wayne, Pennsylvania with my little girlfriends. That is to say that I enjoyed Alistair McIntyre tremendously, and I'm desperately sorry that I am following him. My background is very much one of practical involvement with the culture, having traveled the 50 states, often for 100 days a year over the last 10 years, encountering great varieties of people, politicians, church people, reporters, and a small segment of celebrity culture. And that is the context and the background in which I draw for my remarks, which are of a more practical, political nature than Professor McIntyre's. Since the purpose overall of this first conference is to talk about whether the existence of a culture of death, my role is to examine this in light particularly of judicial decisions on abortion. That is my area of expertise. Therefore, I'm going to speak in the following order. First, to talk about what we might mean by a culture of death. And there I'm going to reflect particularly on John Paul II's Evangelia Vitae and on the Catholic bishops' response to that, particularly in their document, which is probably not very widely known, but really deserves to be. It's as beautiful a reading in a scholarly context as it is on a retreat. It's called Faithful for Life, and it's a pastoral reflection on human life. Then I'm going to look at any evidence of a culture of death on the ground, particularly in the interplay between popular culture and Supreme Court jurisprudence. Third, I'm going to examine particular Supreme Court cases, Casey and the most recent Stenberg v. Carhart, the partial birth abortion case, to see the interplay between law and popular culture. And then finally make some concluding recommendations, which are not bold but rather modest, for the same reasons as Professor McIntyre felt that he could not make conclusive recommendations about where we are now and where we might think about going when it comes to responding to the culture's adaptation to abortion. The culture of death is, what is the culture of death as spoken of by John Paul II and by the Catholic Church in the United States? There are a couple of spots in Evangelium Vitae where the Holy Father gives what may be seen even as nice, interesting lists about how he defines or sees as the preeminent symbol of the culture of death and what he thinks are the foundations for what he is calling a culture of death. He says he was motivated to write Evangelium Vitae because of a particular crisis in the times, for the same reason that when the first social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, was written, that was motivated by a particular crisis at the times. He says the way he sees the crisis of our times is in the fact of the killing that is going on within families of the weakest members of the human family, and not just with the sanction, but with the support of the state, who is calling this killing part of our fundamental rights or liberties, and in some cases is supporting it with state monies. That's where he sees the crisis. And we see, of course, clearly the issues of abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide summarized in that new way. The U.S. bishops responded, in fact, at one point with the comment that, isn't it interesting that it is only your family members, really, that you can kill with federal constitutional sanction? You kill a stranger, then you're in trouble. But the weakest members of your families are those who are subject to the greatest risk. What does that say about the culture? The Pope then speaks about the foundations of this crisis. What could possibly lead to this crisis? And he says something, again, very similar to what Professor McIntyre said, which is at the same time you have a cumulative, vast body of statements about human rights and the dignity of human persons on a worldwide level. You have at the very same time some of the grossest violations of human rights coinciding with that. What could account for this? He then looks at what he calls the foundations of a culture of death. And he sees it in a misguided notion of freedom, particularly in three respects. A notion of freedom that believes freedom is about me, about the individual, versus freedom incorporating within its own definition solidarity with other human persons, particularly the weakest. Second foundation he sees is a notion of freedom that has nothing to do with truth, that believes that freedom is gained through individual choices, through individual opinions, whether or not these have anything to do with any objective standard of truth. And finally, another foundation, a flawed notion of freedom which dissociates freedom with a relationship with God, with the transcendent, and thereby fails to understand who we're supposed to be, how it is we are free, because it doesn't understand what we are for. So he says these are the foundations of what he calls a culture of death. In the Catholic bishops faithful for life, their pastoral response, their reflection on how Evangelium Vitae resounds in American culture, they spoke about a culture of death as one wherein persons would cut themselves adrift from who they're meant to be in light of their creation by a loving God for love. In light of their creation by a God who sent his Son to show us how humans are intended to live. This being living for the other. That the ultimate, the final, the definitive act of the life of Jesus Christ was to give himself over for the other. And of course we see many other examples in his life up to that time of what humans are for, what they're supposed to be about. When Jesus said, "I came that they might have life and have it abundantly," he meant life for the other, life in love, particularly for the most vulnerable. The bishops summarize this in a paragraph that I think is both beautiful and reflects in a pastoral way exactly what the Pope said in Evangelium Vitae. They told the Good Samaritan story and said, today, in our culture, in the U.S. today, the Good Samaritan story haunts us, for it flatly contradicts the presumption so widely held today that our loyalties and obligations are owed only to those of our choice. Rather, it is we who have been chosen to go out of our way for them. You can see how this takes the idea of freedom being about truth for the other, always in solidarity and always in relation to God, and sums it up with the Good Samaritan story. Do we have such a culture? Do we have what our Holy Father and what the bishops think of as a culture of death in our society? Well, if you lived in the world that I lived in for 10 years, reading news clippings daily of things that were just atrocities. When I first read a nurse's account of partial birth abortion, who had been present on the scene when they were done, it reminded me of how I felt in the early days of working with abortion, when I was working for the Bishop's General Counsel office and had to review every file in the pro-life office in response to a document subpoena. We were involved in a lawsuit, and we had certain documents subpoenaed. And I had 8 weeks of reviewing documents and was confronted with the reality of abortion for the first time. I became numb over time. And then partial birth abortion came on the scene. And when I read it, I never forget, I went to our legislative director's office and threw it on his desk and said, "This is a horrid joke that you put on my desk. Why would you do that? This can't be real." The killing and the stories that one reads about the killing of abortion are just overwhelming if you lived in my world and read them on a daily basis. Not just the fact of about 1.3 million abortions every year, early and late, mostly unmarried women, but also married, because the child is inconveniently timed, because the woman is afraid about exposing this to her parents, because the child has a disability. When you are confronted with stories about babies in hefty bags dumped by the side of the road, fallen off a garbage truck, about abortionists who really, for the most part, seem to me in my experience to be not of sound mind. That was mostly but they were off. They were several beats off from the bell curve of people's ordinary sensibilities about human life, like the doctor in Kansas who likes personally to run the incinerator after his third trimester abortions, like the third trimester abortionist who had an odd crush on me and used to say to the reporter who knew us both, "I wish she'd go out with me, but I guess she doesn't want a man who has blood on his hands most of the day." I mean, just many beats off of people's normal understanding of human relationships. When you hear third trimester abortionists being called angels, when you hear about partial birth abortion, when you hear that a more common abortion technique is simply inducing labor early and putting children in the corner of linen closets, or where nurses find them and hold them until they die, or when you hear about the flourishing market in baby body parts, you feel like you're drowning in death, and you say, we must be in a culture of death. And yet, as I said, many of these things seem to be happening with the involvement of people who are not in the bell curve. It is not so generalized. The public's opinion on abortion is far more nuanced than what I'm reading about in these horror stories, these clippings. However, abortion has entered popular culture. And I could give you so many examples of how the acceptance of abortion is part of popular culture. But one time when it really came home to me was when I was invited to be on a Linda Ellerby program. She had I don't know if she still does because I don't have cable, but she was hosting a program on the Lifetime Network, and where she was having conversations with noteworthy women of the times on particular subjects, and had one on abortion several years ago. And as I was sitting in the green room, usually there's one makeup artist for 20 people, but this is a women's network. We each had our own makeup artist. And we're sitting in chairs, all of us. There were 15 women on the show. There were Hollywood celebrities. There were heads of the major pro-abortion interest groups. There were only, was I the only pro-life representative? No, there was a female evangelical Protestant minister and myself who were pro-life. But there were like 13 other women who represented the other side of the issue. Again, they were Hollywood, they were writers from the New York Times and the Washington Post. They were Kate Michelman, they were the heads of the other major pro-abortion groups. And I sat silent while my hair was tortured into television-like appearance and listened to their conversation. And I heard them talk about the weddings they had all mutually attended, and how so-and-so's brother was on the MacArthur Foundation board, and how another woman sitting beside me had received a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant for her work supporting abortion, and how so-and-so's son was getting married in 2 weeks, and they would all be together there, and how such and such a group was sponsoring a jazz festival at Lincoln Center, and how all of their friends would be there. And my reaction was that I had never known quite how much mutual influence in elite circles and how close they were to one another. Yes, another person who was there at that time, prior to becoming the communications director for the White House during the Clinton administration, was the communications director for Planned Parenthood. Another one at that time was the communications director for NARAL, who then went on to become the communications director for Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration. And I never knew quite how much cross-pollination there was in this elite culture. I never knew how out pro-life was. It was a good thing I didn't know, because I may have been intimidated from acting, but I saw its influence in elite culture. And you see it in politics, you see it in the academy, you see it in entertainment. In entertainment, whether it is a Hollywood movie, Academy Award winning, being about the kindly abortionist and how he transforms the mind of a narrow-minded opponent on the issue. The Hollywood celebrities who write books about my abortion and show up at on the mall for the NOW rallies on it. The rock groups who go on summer tours attracting hundreds of thousands of young people who are sponsored by Planned Parenthood and NARAL grants. In politics, you see the Democratic Party being supported with millions of dollars from abortion advocacy groups. You see the Republican Party tied up in knots over the abortion question. I think it could be argued that the abortion issue was dispositive in the choice of the Republican vice presidential candidate this year, and Tom Ridge would be our choice, but for that issue. And the parties neuralgic on that subject right now. You see Emily's list for pro-abortion Democratic women is the single largest political action committee in the United States, the single largest, giving the most money to candidates. You see it in the academy with the resistance to the pro-life position on abortion. The number, among the top 5 most requested speakers on college campuses are abortion advocates, including Sarah Weddington, when that list comes out every year. It has certainly entered elite and popular culture in a way that we see often in our newspapers, in our public events. I do believe the Supreme Court's opinions have been disproportionately influential in this culture. That is not to say that the primary pro-life work, and I will get back to this at the end, is not the influence of hearts and minds to respect life in individual situations. But it is to say that the attention paid by both sides of the abortion issue to the court decisions, particularly the Supreme Court on this matter, is not misplaced. One sees the court reflect the cultural divides on abortion, and then the court's pronouncements, its rhetoric, its reasoning, and the actual results of the cases influence the rhetoric that next comes, which then influences the next Supreme Court decision. By not only its original formation of the abortion right in Roe, but the accumulation of rhetoric in these court decisions about individualism, which they have actually, they use the language of autonomy, a law unto oneself. The court's accumulation of rhetoric about freedom, about family, about women, and even about the nature of truth have had a heavy effect on our culture's understanding about vulnerable human life before birth. The system is a sick system between popular culture, elite culture, and Supreme Court decision-making. I want to look particularly at the original Supreme Court decision on abortion, Roe, to Casey and to Stenberg, the most recent decision on birth abortion, because each of them has promoted the rhetoric and reasoning of the culture of death, but each is also noteworthy for its contribution to particular elements, particular foundations of the culture of death. Again, I refer most particularly to the categories that John Paul II laid out, the foundations of the culture of death as being embodied in a notion of freedom which disregards solidarity with others, truth, and the understanding of the human person in relation to our Creator. I think the greatest casualty of Roe versus Wade had to do with truth, with an understanding that if we're really going to be free, we also have to attend to the truth. Roe simply invented a new medical, which became a sociological term for human life before birth, calling it potential human life. There's no, and it did this in order to allow the state to strike down laws that were forbidding abortion. We couldn't call it human life flat out, even though that's what the scientific and medical literature was calling it at that time. You had to make it something less, something not as valuable. And so they simply invented out of thin air the term potential human life, and thereby fueled for the next 27 years a controversy that on the part of those supporting abortion tried largely to avoid the fact that there was a human life at stake in this at all. They just tried to leap over that truth at all. Another casualty of Roe was the idea that freedom ought to be carried out in solidarity with others. Roe separated women's procreation from a relational context. It separated the woman and the child from the father, from the family, at large and from the community. It put her in a privacy box. It said it wasn't putting her in an absolutely closed privacy box, but it did. More fundamentally, creation. It took something that was inherently relational and said it was not. Up to that time, contraception had attempted to do that, but contraception fails so often. I mean, I don't think it's widely known that 58% of all abortion patients were using contraception in the month they got pregnant. I mean, it is not that the rise in contraception, the use and availability and the public drumbeat about it has decreased our abortion problem, but rather it has actually, its use and availability has gone along with an increased number of abortions and with a rising percentage of the number of abortion patients who were using contraception at the time they got pregnant. Well, built up the notion that a pregnant woman is really someone who ought to be self-absorbed, that her relationship with the pregnancy is mostly one of opposition. There's a paragraph in Roe where the court goes on about the difficulties of motherhood and the psychological difficulties of taking up care for a life for so many years, and especially if you're not married and especially if the child has a disability with which you feel you cannot cope. I read that paragraph one way before I had children and one way after it. I mean, after it, I just wanted to guffaw and say, oh, wow, being a mother has psychological implications that may be damaging to your psyche on some days. Well, imagine that, that I don't feel not only humbled but humiliated one out of every other day because I feel inadequate to this task. The Supreme Court attempted almost to make that the norm of a woman's relationship to her children. After that, and the many cases which tried between Roe and Casey to separate the child from her parents when it came to parental involvement, to separate the woman from the community's care about even her health when she undergoes an abortion by striking down informed consent requirements and other medical safety requirements. The next most important case for our purposes was the Casey decision, where I think the greatest casualties and the greatest contributions it made to the culture of death had to do with its pronouncements about truth and about God. The Casey decision said outright, we're really not going to examine whether Roe was rightly decided or not. I mean, all these tantalizing hints given by Justice O'Connor and Rehnquist and others prior to that time, O'Connor in particular, that, as she said in Webster, there would come a time to examine whether Roe was rightly decided, and the court would do it when that was squarely presented. When it came to the Casey decision, the court said, in O'Connor in particular, in the plurality opinion, we're not going to get into the question of whether it's rightly decided. What's important is that we have decided it, and we have called the competing factions in this country on this issue to come to peace with this. Abortion is here to stay. Too many women have come to count on it as a backup in case contraception should fail. They have come to order their lives on its availability. The truth of the thing is not what we are concerned about. It's the practical fact that people have come to order their lives in this. Whether this is good or not, we will not say. Another aspect of truth, and even God, and whether we should act with any relationship to anything transcendent to ourselves in Casey, I think is best exemplified by what some people, I think Russ Hittinger in an interview once called it the mystery passage in Casey. I have referred to it often as the wacko passage because it's the kind of thing one sees in articles and cases about abortion that people would feel would be intellectually beneath them in other arenas. So abortion lends itself to the most extreme and unsupported pronouncements in the literature. The court said when they were discussing how it is that abortion ought to be a constitutional right, that at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under the compulsion of the state. So in other words, at the heart of the Constitution, its idea about liberty is whatever one's individual opinion about what the shape of the universe is. I mean, what a statement. Interestingly, in cases after that, particularly in the context of assisted suicide, the court was very quick to just limit that to abortion because it's by definition practically, unable to be limited. It's a huge pronouncement about what human freedom is. It's purely about one's own opinion. It's purely about me. It's not about truth. It's not about others. In Stenberg, the public debate leading up to Stenberg and the court's decision itself were some of the most painful examples of a lack of understanding about what freedom ought to be and an understanding of freedom rather as about me and my opinion. I lived the debate leading up to the Supreme Court decision as intimately as I lived family life. I had 2 children during that time, and I literally lobbied until I was in labor with both of them on partial birth abortion. I think I know this issue almost too well. And what I saw in that debate, again, you would think I would be numb to it, but I was absolutely horrified. The debate leading up to it, despite the horror of the idea of a child being stabbed with a pair of scissors while he or she was almost completely delivered, for really no other reason, and this comes out of the mouths of the doctors who invented it, then it was more convenient for the abortionist to do so. Then doctors, remember the co-inventors were not OBGYNs, they did not have a lot of training in pregnancy or abortion. That the doctors who were doing it could be more assured that they had completed the contract, essentially that the baby was dead, when they did it before their very eyes than doing it in a dismemberment abortion where, oops, every once in a while you take off a lot of limbs but the baby doesn't die when you finally get the main part of the body out. The focus on, as the abortion advocacy groups did, on the anguish of the mothers who discovered they had seriously disabled children. I mean, they became literally poster women. Big, beautiful posters of happy women with summer hats embracing the children in their family who were born and lived. The animosity toward disabled children. I debated Betty Friedan on Hardball once, and she referred to disabled children as monsters and the Catholic Church as horrid for forcing women to raise monsters. The focus on the individual as opposed to the vulnerable other was enormous. And truth was absolutely, I debated abortion for 7 years up to that point, and I had never seen truth so abused as in the partial birth debate. Remember now, the doctors who invented it had a lot of information, like lots. They had records of when they did it, why they did it, what kind of anesthesia they used when they did it. What were the situations of the children and the mothers? They had congressional testimony. They had reams of quotations in articles in the American Medical News and in other papers. Despite all of this, abortion advocates continued to put out information that there was no such procedure. It was simply a procedure for removing already dead children, so it wasn't an abortion procedure. Then after that was disproved, they said the child did not die by being stabbed and suctioned and crushed. No, indeed, the child was anesthetized to death until the pro-legal abortion director of the American Society of Anesthesiologists said, don't say this, please. Pregnant women can undergo surgery. And if I gave them the amount of anesthesia that you claim is being used to kill these children in partial birth abortion, I would kill all my patients instead. The mother would have to die first or be in a coma for 5 days. Then they claimed it was only done in specific instances where the mother would otherwise die. This was absolutely disproved. Then they claimed that it was only done a certain number of times per year. I thought the pinnacle of sort of the revelation of their lies, I testified along with abortion advocacy groups and one other pro-lifer for 5.5 hours in front of a joint House-Senate Judiciary Committee. When they were asked why they continued to put out bad information, the National Abortion Federation, which is a trade association of abortionists, they hire lobbyists in Washington like a lot of other people, said that she had taken down this misinformation that I've just described from her website, but that it had miraculously reconstructed itself after she put the correct information. There was a storm. It struck their internet site. All the old wrong information came back, and that's why it was still on their website. I mean, absolutely the most unbelievable lies. At that point, the head of the National Right to Life Committee produced pages of their website, which he had downloaded every single day as long as it had been up, and found that it had never gone down and no lightning storm had ever reconstructed it. I mean, absolutely unbelievable level of lying. Unbelievable. We saw then, not surprisingly, that when the Supreme Court rendered its opinion about Nebraska's partial birth abortion statute, truth remained a tremendous casualty. Right away, you knew we were in trouble because the court used the language of a woman's right to choose in its opening paragraphs of the majority opinion. You knew that a particular viewpoint had been adopted. The court spelled out very particular abortion procedures in gruesome detail in the course of rendering its opinion, to the point where even Justice Kennedy, who had been in the plurality in the Casey decision, had to say, does the court even know what it said? Do you realize, he said, that you have laid out abortion from the perspective of abortionists, but have not all understood the ordinary person's shocked response to this? Do you know what you have written even? He then went through himself a description of abortion, particularly dismemberment abortion, and said, in the most blunt language one could imagine, the child dies just as an adult child would from this procedure. It bleeds to death as it is torn limb from limb. That sort of truth about we were confronting the death of a human being was not understood as such by the majority opinion. In a Third Circuit opinion that's come down since then, we see an infection of this sort of thinking. The Third Circuit was confronted with a description of partial birth abortion and a Farmer opinion, and said, well, that this is not clearly like birth because the mother didn't intend birth. She intended an abortion. So avoid the fact that what you have is all the usual medical procedures for a delivery of a child interrupted by a killing, and say, well, that may be what it looks like when you describe it factually, but that's not what it is, because that's not what the mother intended it to be. The Stenberg majority opinion also completely overlooked the truth of the medical necessity of abortion, this particular form. It basically said that even though the medical experts who testified did not do it themselves, and couldn't find a situation in which they could claim it would be absolutely medically necessary, because the abortionist, Dr. Carhart, claimed that he could imagine a situation in which he thought it was medically necessary, that the court would go along with that. That was all it took. As Kennedy said, so it is not Nebraska or even medical associations that decide what is medically necessary anymore. It is Dr. Carhart who sets the policy for the state of Nebraska and thus for the United States. So what does one say in response to these Supreme Court opinions? And I have just a few observations, because I think we're in a very difficult situation. We can't pursue by law partial birth abortion as a legal technique, because the Supreme Court has told us that we have to do it in such a way that really makes the law completely ineffective. Stenberg said we had to have a health exception. So we have to have a health exception to near infanticide, even though no one can think of a situation in which health of the mother would require this. I still think, however, that partial birth abortion and the whole campaign to educate people about it was on the right track. I am of some divided mind because on the one hand, I feel the public is becoming increasingly numb to the gruesome realities, and that if we pursue the track of talking about partial birth abortion or these children in hospitals in Ohio and Chicago deliberately being induced to be born only to die as an abortion method, infanticide as an abortion method, that we will only numb people's consciousness further. However, I am slightly more persuaded by the fact that we are seeing real movement in the better polls, the ones who ask more nuanced questions about people's opinions on abortion. And they are moving in the direction of, I would say, a moderate way of summarizing it is reconsidering abortion, thinking that perhaps it is not good in more situations than they thought before, thinking that perhaps the abortion advocacy movement is a little more extreme than they thought of before. I also know that abortion advocates know that this focus on the horror of abortion itself is working because of their desperate attempts to put the emphasis back on early abortion through RU 486. And also, I mean, during the partial birth abortion debate, Planned Parenthood, I remember Christmas Eve came out with the delightful announcement that they would now be doing early syringe abortions in the first couple weeks of pregnancy. And I remember being asked to comment by USA Today and saying, "Happy birthday, Jesus Christ. We have a new early abortion method." I mean, wouldn't Planned Parenthood just release that on Christmas Eve? I think, therefore, that discussion of partial birth abortion, the new legislative initiative that Jerry's going to talk about, the Born Alive Infants Protection Act, actually does move people to think, to reconsider our popular acceptance of the idea that abortion is with us and will always be with us. Finally, however, like Professor McIntyre, I believe that there is a fundamental conversion that is required. Much more fundamental. And it involves just what he said, which is listening to the misgivings and the questions that people have, not just about abortion, but about the very fundamental Christian anthropological questions. Why am I here? What am I for? Why do we suffer? Why ought we to suffer? And to introduce them to Christian principles about what we are for. What's about, including very specifically Christian principles about what human sexual relationships are for, what women's fertility is all about, what parent-child relationships are about, what family is about. I think only these really fundamental conversations, listening to questions, offering some points for reflection, are really going to help people to move away from an uncomfortable but yet acceptance of abortion in our culture. And to consider once again, and to maybe even come to accept the fundamental reality that real freedom as a woman, as a couple, in a marriage, as a family, as parents, does involve deference to the truth, care for the other, and an understanding about what people are for. That real freedom, real happiness, real life involves understanding oneself as chosen to love, whereby, as St. John of the Cross always says, and thereby love grows. Choose to love, and there you will find love, and love will grow. As opposed to understanding ourselves as actors who get to choose who to love. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Helen Alvare. Our next speaker is Gerard Bradley, who is Professor of Law here at the Notre Dame Law School. He is, in addition to working in the halls of the Legal Academy, he is a public intellectual. He is, among other things, President of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. He is co-editor with John Finnis of the American Journal of Jurisprudence. and he has testified before Congress on matters to do with abortion and other legislative issues to do with the beginning of life, and it's about those issues that he will speak to us today.
Thank you, Paul. If this suggestion of fetal personhood is established, Jane Roe's case collapses, where the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. So said the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade. The logic was and is sound. If the unborn are legally recognized persons, then abortion rights are, effectively speaking, gone. This is the first of the two presuppositions of recent pro-life legislative activity. The presupposition being the priority of unborn life, if it is that of a person, over a woman's interest in abortion. The suggestion of fetal personhood enticed no one on the Roe court. The 7-member majority bought the pro-abortion argument in its entirety. The two dissenters, Rehnquist and White, adopted what's called the states' rights view of abortion. On this view, which is shared by Justices Thomas and Scalia, the unborn are not persons within the meaning of the 14th Amendment. But neither is some right to abortion found in the 14th Amendment. So, states are free to adopt the view that the unborn are persons and to prohibit abortions, as states are free to adopt the view that the unborn are non-entities and license abortion, as did the Roe Court. There is then no judicial constituency for what I believe to be the constitutionally correct answer to abortion. Abortion is prohibited by the Constitution because the unborn are persons guaranteed the equal protection of our laws against homicide, the laws which protect me and you against the deadly assaults of you and me. The unborn are such legal persons if they really, truly are persons, and they are indeed truly persons. But a popular constituency, not judicial, but a popular constituency for this view has been around since Roe. Shortly after the Roe decision in 1973, much energy was put into a human life constitutional amendment, which would have put into the supreme law of our land the proposition that the unborn are persons, though, as it happens, utterly dependent persons with undeveloped capacities. This amendment remains part of the Republican platform, a document which candidates are not expected to read, much less support. The amendment movement is dead. But over the last few years, a great deal of legislation, state and federal, has given expression to the truth about the humanity of the unborn. For this talk, I put aside side constraints upon the exercise of the abortion liberty, things like informed consent, parental notification, and waiting periods. These are good things, but they prescind from the question about the unborn. They can be and usually are justified on the assumption that abortion is a medical procedure involving one, not two patients. I shall talk today about genuine pro-life legislation, legislation which declares or implies that the unborn, those being born, and those just a very, very short time ago born, are persons with a right not to be killed. Someone might object that no legislature may define person consistent with Roe in the cases following it. For, the objection states, the Supreme Court has declared that the unborn are not persons. Joined plausible, though I think controversial, premises about judicial supremacy, the argument concludes, the court has spoken. Unborn babies are not persons, and that's it. But the Supreme Court has never held that the unborn are, simply speaking, not persons. The Roe Court instead said that it did not need to resolve the difficult question of when life begins. The Roe Court said the judiciary is not in a position to speculate as to the answer to the question, when does life begin? The court has never held that legislative bodies, including the Congress, must be similarly modest about the question of life. The court has said that no legislature could override the rights of the pregnant woman by adopting an answer to the question of when life begins, so that the woman was deprived of all freedom of choice to abort. That is, and to use a 1989 Webster case as an illustration, in that case, the state of Missouri had legislated that the life of each human being begins at conception, and that unborn children have protectable interests in life, health, and well-being. A lower federal court in Webster adopted the view of Roe stated as an objection here by me. The lower court said the state had impermissibly adopted a theory of when life begins. But the Supreme Court reversed this lower federal court. The Supreme Court said that its own prior decisions, including Roe, meant, and I quote the court, only that a state could not justify an abortion regulation otherwise invalid under Roe versus Wade on the ground that it embodied the state's view of when life begins. This is the second presupposition of recent pro-life legislation. The unborn may be recognized as legal persons for some purposes, up to a point with regard to some other person's activities. We can now bring into focus the pro-life strategy behind recent legislation. Maximum affirmation of the personhood of the unborn, consistent with respect, preservation of a woman's legal right to choose abortion, with a view to complete legal adoption of the opening suggestion. The unborn are constitutionally recognized persons. I shall conclude in a few minutes with a word about the prospects, as I see them, for this strategy's success. In the meantime, what about this recent legislation? Three types of recent legislation deserve mention. Each of these is pursued at both the state and federal level. I'll speak only, specifically at least, about the federal example of each type of legislation. The first two have been distributed to you. Dave Solomon told me yesterday at the coffee house that I should bring stuff to give you. And we ran out of Twinkies at home, so the only stuff I could find was some law. And I think all of you, or I hope all of you have gotten a couple of copies, a copy of each of the two laws. These two laws, each, the bills, not laws yet, has been passed by the House of Representatives. Each is pending in the Senate. They are the Unborn Victims of Violence Act and the Born Alive Infants Protection Act of 2000. First, the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. It's a national counterpart to the 26 or so state feticide laws. A feticide law declares and enforces, as against the whole world save the pregnant woman and anyone cooperating with her procured abortion, the equal right of the life of the child, equal right to life of the child in the womb. Again, as to the whole world, but the pregnant woman and those cooperating in her abortion, the unborn child is a person with a right not to be killed or harmed. That's feticide. Feticide laws are beyond constitutional doubt so long as the pregnant woman's options to abort or not are preserved. And a glance at the first of these two pieces of legislation, the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, I think it's Section 2C, will show that the federal legislation preserves the woman's right to abortion in language as clear as possible. The argument in Congress has been against the bill's aims. That is to say, the argument against the bill is intended to efface the unborn as a distinct subject of a legally cognizable harm. Opponents in the House of Representatives argued that in infanticide, or I should say in feticide, in so-called feticide, the harm was exclusively to the mother, and that the legal response to so-called feticide should be enhanced penalties for the one crime with one victim, assault upon the woman, for the additional harm done to her right to carry a baby to term if that's what she wishes to do. From the opponent's point of view, the victim, so to speak, or the interest harmed is not a baby, but a woman's reproductive freedom. The second piece of legislation in your hands is pretty well named. It is the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. It states that for all federal legal purposes, anyone born alive is a person with an equal right to life. This bill would establish that while Roe and cases following it gave women a right to terminate a pregnancy, they give no one a right to terminate a baby. Now, this is not quite the slam dunk matter you might think it is of stating the obvious. What of the limit case of a woman who exercises her liberty, her Roe versus Wade liberty, to terminate a pregnancy? A woman who wishes to avoid being a mother, but who ends up the mother of an infant anyway. This is the case of the botched abortion, the failed attempt at procured abortion. In this situation, at least, opponents have argued there's a violation of the spirit of Roe, if not the letter. And there is language, a lot of it, in the Roe opinion to support this objection. The court in Roe extensively cataloged what it called the detriment that the government would impose upon a pregnant woman by prohibiting abortion. Again, quoting the Roe court. Additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed by child care. There's also the distress associated with the unwanted child. And there is the problem of bringing a child into a family already unable, psychologically or otherwise, to care for it. In other cases, additional difficulties and continuing stigma of unwed motherhood may be involved. Obviously, these are not very much detriments of pregnancy. They are the burdens of having and raising children. But now we can appreciate, perhaps, Roe's two-sided deep vulnerability to careful counter-argument. For these considerations, the ones I just read to you, set a trajectory well past abortion on into infanticide and beyond. This would seem to prove too much. But Roe's flank is still also hopelessly exposed. The Roe court never engaged the question, what is the truth of the matter about the unborn? Nevertheless, beginning with Roe itself, the Supreme Court has consistently, though arbitrarily, drawn the line of a woman's authority to control reproduction at birth. Questions about why this line, this moment, the second birth, carries such unsurpassable stress in the abortion jurisprudence it has offered to us. Questions about this have gone unanswered, now are rebuffed by reliance upon the authority of past judicial decisions, starting with Roe. Now, the main objection expressed in the House of Representatives to the Born Alive Act was articulated by New York Representative Jerry Nadler. Now, Nadler described himself at the hearing at which I was present as, quote, the most pro-choice person on the face of the earth. Nadler also, by the way, puts one in mind in terms of his appearance of Jabba the Hutt. Nadler voted for the bill, protesting that he thought it was all got up to put pro-choice folks like Al Gore in an election year pickle. Gee, would pro-life people do that? But Nadler's stated position was that the bill was unnecessary. Nadler said, everybody knows that once someone is born, that's it. You can't be killed. You're a baby. And so, Nadler concluded, existing state and federal laws against homicide protect everybody, including those people very, very recently born alive. Now, the argument against Nadler was really Paul Sigmund's colleague at Princeton, Peter Singer. That is to say, witnesses on the pro-life side at the hearing at which Nadler spoke and protested said there are people, Peter Singer among them, who have picked up on the trajectory and are riding along the path charted by that there are good reasons why the liberty of Roe should be extended sometime, perhaps some brief time, beyond birth. And it is arbitrary to limit these options, this option to abort, at birth. I turn to the third area of legislative activity, partial birth abortion. Many states have enacted bans on the dilation and extraction procedure. It is even more gruesome than you perhaps can imagine, even with Helen's help. Twice the Congress has passed a partial birth abortion ban. Twice President Clinton has vetoed it. The ostensible issue here is maternal health. Even the President says he favors a ban on partial birth abortion so long as there's an exception for the life and health of the mother. Pro-life forces oppose this offer of cooperation, hands across the border of disagreement. They recognize it as the bait-and-switch scam that it is. Since health in this area of law means all aspects of a woman's well-being, physical, psychological, economic, familial, a health exception would be indistinguishable from partial birth abortion on demand. That is the idea behind insisting upon a health exception. If a woman and her physician say that she has decided for reasons satisfactory to her to have a partial birth abortion, no one has a legal right or authority to gainsay it. Now, banning the DNX procedure, partial birth abortion, saves no lives, for it does not prevent anybody from having an abortion. It just bans them, prevents them from having abortion in a particular way. Banning the procedure, however, establishes, I think at least implicitly, that a child is born or is being born and deserves the rights of persons, including the right not to be killed, even if the mother wishes it were otherwise. Perhaps most important, focus upon partial birth abortion highlights the underlying but profound arbitrariness of the whole abortion regime inaugurated by the Supreme Court 27 years ago. If a baby a millisecond removed from the womb is a person, why not a baby halfway out of the birth canal? If a baby halfway out of the birth canal is a person with a right not to be killed, how about a baby whose head is visible in the birth canal? How about a baby whose head is out of the birth canal? Well, what are the prospects for this strategy? The strategy, in one articulation of it, is surround the abortion liberty with markers of the unborn's personhood, hoping that by multiplication of these markers, one not only surrounds the abortion liberty, but demonstrates its underlying arbitrariness and undefended flank to the point where it collapses. This strategy relies upon logic. The abortion liberty has never rested upon logic, and logic will not undo it. If the matter were treated logically, however, one would still have to supply a missing premise, even if all of these laws are passed. The missing premise is this: the personhood of the unborn is not the kind of thing that depends upon or changes or flip-flops depending upon who would harm the unborn child, third-party batterer or abortionist. It's not the kind of thing that depends upon exactly where the baby is. Mostly born, almost mostly born, a few inches before birth or a few inches after. It's not the kind of thing that depends upon how much one or more of us wish to treat someone as less than the person than that someone actually is. Now, perhaps this missing premise is obvious. Still, it is the unacknowledged premise of resistance to the pro-life cause. It seems to me that almost no baby is saved by any of these laws. Why pursue them at all? I think the worthy effect of pro-life legislation is, as I have suggested twice, to expose the profound arbitrariness of the abortion regime. Now, not to shame the regime's defenders into changing their minds, that's scarcely possible, but those in our society uncertain of what to think about abortion or what to do about it, or both, can perhaps through these efforts see clearly, finally, not through a glass as if darkly, but clearly, that after 30 years of debate and education and litigation, it is indeed a question of getting and using power. Getting and using power to protect the defenseless by and through law. I don't mean that the pro-life argument is vacant, lacks force of its own, that the pro-life cause must depend upon power and simply law. Quite the opposite. I mean that we must get and use power to unblock the passageways of logic and sound argument, passageways closed off by the pro-abortion side's suppression of questions through evasion, rationalization, and demonization.
We have plenty of time for questions. It probably would be better to use the floor microphones, and helpful to others if you say who you are when you do ask a question.
Hello, I'm Sydney Callahan. I want to thank you for your speeches and for your work, your wonderful work that both of you have done. I want to ask one thing. It seems to me to get the imagination of people to understand that this is a human person is easier at the end, of course. Partial birth abortion, I think, is going to win. And as you go back further and further, it gets harder and harder. Now, it seems to me the invention of sonograms has been a wonderful thing for the pro-life movement because people can see a little baby in there. But as you go back further and further, it gets more difficult for the imagination to make the argument. Now, when I tried to make this argument, I said, I don't know that you can make it on any individual embryo. And one strategy I'd like to ask you whether you think could be fruitful, and that is to make the argument about this is a member of a species. It isn't just one, it's a member of a species. And each member is, therefore, has the collective status of the species. And this brought me back to the Endangered Species Act. And I once in one of my struggles, as Helen knows, I've all been on the road struggling with these ones, and with someone who shall remain nameless, I said, but don't you believe in the protection of baby seals and, acts and legal acts for that? And the person said, yes, but humans are a replaceable species, in the sense that you can always have another. However, if you really have a protected species, like eagles, it becomes horrible to kill their eggs because it becomes clear that that's part of protecting this species. So I wonder if this new approach to sort of an ecological consciousness, a consciousness of humans as a member of a species, a sense of trying to get the collective, we would call it, members of one body or one family, but if that's not going to work, is there another approach that might be helpful in even the legal arena? Thank you.
A couple of things. On a very practical note with regard to early abortions versus late, the vast majority of abortions take place between 8 and 12 weeks. That's the, somewhere between 80 and 90%, which is still pretty late when you think about sonograms. And that is not a theoretical response. This is purely, how do we react practically? I don't know how many here have had a sonogram recently. I've had 6 in the past 7 years, beginning at 8 and 9 weeks. And it's pretty stunning, the baby look-alike at 8 and 9 weeks. You can see, so I actually think there's a lot to be said for that. Everybody on both sides of the issue knows that people's moral imagination is up for grabs, and that the sonogram is a powerful tool. I don't know how many of you ever heard Harrison Hickman, who's a pollster, and a pollster specifically for the National Abortion Rights Action League, is one of his clients, and he's very much in sympathy with them, who, when he polled and focused group tested NARAL's slogan, "Who Decides?" which he came up with, went before a NARAL convention and said that the sonogram was the greatest threat to this campaign. So practically speaking, there can be some impact in simply putting the picture in front of people. However, it is really difficult, and everyone, again, on both sides of this question knows it. And that is why abortion advocates stress early abortion and so forth. I'd be interested in hearing Jerry's reaction, but my first reaction to the idea of holding up solidarity with other members of the human family as an argument is that it ought to be done, but that it's not likely to succeed soon. I've read people who comment that the reason the animal rights movement can get away with it is because they're talking about living creatures who no one has to take care of for 21 years on a 24-hour-a-day basis. You know, it's the difference between, it's a sweet, dependent little creature, but you don't have to take care of it, and therefore you can expend all the free sympathy and empathy you want without any responsibility on the other side, and children are inherently different from that. It's part of why, very frankly, you know, I fear RU486. I also think it will not get as widespread use as people believe. I don't think a lot of doctors are going to enter into an abortion simply because they can do it with a pill versus doing it with, and I don't think a lot of women are going to repeat abortions with it because it's considered by its own manufacturer more psychologically damaging to women, and because women say themselves they feel very personally responsible for killing the child with RU486. Still, I fear what it will do to the abortion debate in a general sense because of the focus on, the first 7 weeks of pregnancy is nothing. That's what I can say at the moment.
Well, imagination, of course, is not my strength. I am, after all, a law professor. But I would say that one of the great assets may depend upon imagination, it may not, but the great asset we have is that people's natural language for pregnancy from the moment anyone's aware of the pregnancy is the language of baby and motherhood. It's only, I think, and this is an observation about popular culture and the way people speak, it's only once the question about the continued survival of the unborn, when there's some reason to think the mother may want to have an abortion, that people begin to speak of it a different way. Autopilot, sort of robo-language in our culture from the beginning of a pregnancy is, this is now a mom, and that's a baby inside.
I'm another Sydney Blanchet Ruth. I met Sydney Callahan a few years ago, too. We discussed our name. I also spoke with you, Helen, about 4 years ago at Harvard when you spoke with Marianne Glendon and Richard John Newhouse. And I think Jerry knows I'm a fan of his, but I will also say that you were enormously important to me simply as a role model. And Jerry falls into the same category as well, because I see both of you as people who inspire me to live the Catholic life in the way that you, Jerry has now 8, 9 children? Counting?
Well, I haven't called home yet today, but I think it's 8.
So my question to you is, and I, unlike Jerry, I'm not a law professor. I have an arts and literature background, and I actually do have a vivid imagination. But I have to say, in a way, it wasn't until I moved to South Bend 3 years ago from Boston that I began to really see living a Catholic life. And my question to you, Helen, is, in spite of the fact that you're a lawyer, how do you see jumping off of, well, what I would call the contentious continuum into the sphere of trust? And have you had positive experiences with women, for instance, in Hollywood, who look at you for the first time and go, whoa, there's something here about her that speaks to me that I can't, to just move their imaginations forward a little bit. Am I clear?
I think so. I can remember I spoke at, the Creative Coalition. It used to be run by, is it Christopher Reeves now? Maybe run by Robin Williams. But they asked me to speak with Whoopi Goldberg and Lily Tomlin and Ron Silverman and Blair Brown and a number of them. And Blair Brown, who, you remember her in The Days and Nights of Molly Dodd, which was one of the more thoughtful, she's actually acted in a lot of thoughtful things. She said to me that, the articulation of the church's position had made some difference in her thinking, just that women with a brain could embrace it. And then I met some of these others at a different Creative Coalition event who simply sort of congratulated me for showing up because the air was so thick with opposition. It was at the opening of, what do they call those, Hard Rock Cafes? They had these debates on abortion. They started inviting me to go from city to city. Very odd, but I have found, and now I have students who, some agree, some don't. Some signed up to be advisees of mine, I think in my first couple of months in this field, and then backed off immediately upon learning, before they even had their first meeting with me, upon learning my background. Some did not, even though they disagreed. And I find in conversations, this may sound simplistic, that the virtues of friendliness, listening, and that's a real discipline with me, to just shut up and listen, and saying, which I am truthful when I say, that I understand where their opinion came from. You can understand, especially as a working mom, how it is that one comes to the conclusion in this society that you have to have absolute control over when and where and how and why you're going to have children. You can understand how they got from A to B, and yet you think there's something that's more worthy of them. And I'm always selling it to myself, spiritually and practically, and I'm always selling in these encounters, is the happiness of a life lived when you give the other the benefit of the doubt. When you are, just again, that really simple virtue of kindness and listening. And I say to them that a pro-life viewpoint is one explicit conclusion of that life. And certainly it has some appeal from that perspective. I never, in all the years I worked full-time on this, never so much talked about the killing of babies, except when some brutal new thing came about. You had to say, this is a horrid killing. But more always talked about it as the end product. Abortion is the end product of a way of living that was not open to human life. And again, I spent a lot of time with post-aborted women too. And they will tell you that themselves. When they tell you their stories, it was a life that could not possibly commit to another. Not only because of the sexual relationship they were in, but because of their background. And suggest to them a new kind of life. It's really a kind of evangelization. And it sounds very simplistic, but just like Professor McIntyre said, I believe and I have seen that people they have that question and they want to have that conversation.
As someone who's deeply concerned with the culture of death issues like militarism and our current peace by threat policy, as someone who believes often what Dorothy Day said, that our problem stems from our acceptance of this filthy, rotten system, and as someone who visits every 14 days a good man on Indiana's death row, given that, ought I still swallow hard and consider voting for George Bush?
Jerry, you want to take it?
I believe you distinctly said Helen.
It's both wonderful and awful to be cut off from the nonpartisan bishops' conference. One of the things I always loved was the fact that we believed, and I believe, that gospel values cannot be reduced to the platform of a political party. And I still believe that with all my heart. But I'm in a position now where I'm allowed to speak of these things because it's purely personal. I will just be open about it. I am a pro-life Democrat who comes from hardcore Cuban Republicans. And if any of you know Cuban Republicans, that's a different breed. You hate Castro first and Kennedy second by faith. They feel there's a certain kind of patriotism and militarism, at least in my extended family. So I have all these influences. There's another thing that influences me tremendously. Recent studies done by Stephen Wagner, they were published in Crisis, but I've heard him talk about them at greater length. That makes me want to cry, and it's this, that people who practice a faith, any faith, have been leaving the Democratic Party. People who actually, go to some services on a regular basis in their church. This kills me because it ruins the hopes I had that the Democratic Party is being pushed at the grassroots and at the DNC level to do the right thing. And I see in more and more of their leadership, and I must say Al Gore to me is an exemplar of this, a grasping on to some of the wonderful end conclusions of a truly humane thinking that has a lot in common with Christianity, but it has no basis anymore. There's not a depth of reasoning there that assures me that they will do the right thing in the end, or that they will do the right thing across the board. I am casting my lot, therefore, in this election with the Republicans, only at the presidential level, not at every local level, because I believe there is some openness to the fundamental matters about the value of life. Also because my feeling about this particular candidate is his, George Bush Jr., is his lack of ideology on some things. I've spoken to him in his practical response to poverty, sort of as, well, it's not good for them, it's not good for the country. I find an openness to my beliefs about the dignity of the human person. And I also find an openness in the party at that level to even listening to pro-lifers. And I'm just not finding that at the presidential level on the other side. In fact, they're so entrenched with former leadership in the abortion groups. I know that I'm in a unique position because I've done abortion for so long, but I cannot go either with a person or a party that has no room for deeper arguments about the sanctity of life. I just can't. So now I've made myself tremendously divisive, which I had not done before, but there you have it.
It's after 12. We should probably just take one more question, I'm afraid, in spite of the large number there are.
I'm Bob Nagosic. I'm out in the field. And I like to go to lobby days in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the church, and also to our state capitol. And in general, pro-life or abortion issue isn't taken up in where we lobby with Congress people or legislators. And we're handed from Network, Catholic Social Lobby, a list of the issues of this social justice issues of this current campaign, and pro-life is absent. I asked why, and they said it's very controversial. So Helen, would you like to comment?
Well, obviously, I think that's a problem. I also think it fails to attend to what particularly John Paul II has been saying, which is it's hard to trust a a platform about the dignity of the human person that does not rest on the foundation of the sanctity of the human person. It's hard to trust where that's going to go. It is, the church ought not to be intimidated by what is politically controversial. I mean, despite the fact that in the end, each of us has to decide who we're going to vote for and cast our lot, which ends up being with one party or another, and I wish that were not so. I wish there were more choices there. That it is not the church's job to admit the divisive things so as to make us more easily able to make those choices. It's just it's the church's obligation, I believe, to lay out, to the best of their ability, the political implications of the gospel, which should be done in broad strokes and not with attention to very particular details so as to confuse people between what is really Christian teaching and what is political details.
Thank you both very much. Thank you all. Let me remind you. I should remind you that the conference reconvenes in this room at 1:30. So enjoy lunch and see you later.
So you voted for Bush?